about some basic distinctions in type to help you think about different fonts that are available and how and when they might be used. We're just going to look at some basic classifications and some type terms. Uh, and some of these you will probably know because you have been walking around with a machine capable of setting professional type for some years. You have a computer that probably came with a lot of fonts on it. Um, and so you have been exposed to type in a way that design students of a generation ago never would have. But you'll probably find some things that are a little bit different as well, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into some type classifications. So the first distinction I want to talk about is the difference between serif and sans serif. And you may know automatically that this is the serif, or you may not. But the first types that were used in Europe were all generally serif types. The first types that were printed by Gutenberg did not look like this. They were what are called fractors, or sometimes they're mislabeled Old English style fonts that are a little bit spiky and a little bit close together. And I read a book about those once, and it said that those were very efficient and very legible in German because of the special nature of German. Those are not so legible in English, though, so as or France, or a number of other languages. So as printing moved into Southern Europe, it took on the characteristic of the calligraphy that was local to those places, which was a font that looked quite a bit like this one, drawn with a pen. And the serifs, these little tags at the end of the letter, when you finish bringing the stroke down, if you imagine that you have a flat tip pen, or it could be like a flat brush, and it's used to just finish off that character. And these were really all the fonts that were available in the earliest days of printing. And this, which comes in later, the original sans serifs, they were originally called grotesques, and I've heard a couple of explanations for that. I've read a lot of type books, and I've read conflicting explanations for why they were called grotesques, and I'll give you them both, even though I'm not sure which is accurate. One of them was that they were just ugly compared to these fonts without serifs were considered unattractive. And the other is that gross in German is just another way of saying big. And these fonts tended to be bigger and bolder and brasher. Obviously not this one here, but the original sans serifs tend to be fairly burly and used for advertising purposes. So they were considered grotesque because they were just big. Now, the other biggest distinction that you're probably already aware of is Roman and italic, but I want to tell you a couple of things you may not have noticed about these two different forms. One is that an italic is not just a slanted version of a regular font. You can, in any of the computer programs we use, slant it artificially, but if you did that, all that you'd be doing is taking this style of A and bending it along with this G. But if you look at this A, and this is not universally true, but usually true of italics, and one of the things, I'll probably come back to this point, is that we talk about typefaces in terms of family. And so when you look at designs relative to each other, there are a lot of things that overlap about them, a lot of things they have in common, but it may not be everything. So one of the things about this italic, which is true of traditional italics, is that it's also a little bit more cursive. So this is the faster version of a drawn A. This one would take less time. You know, this could be done in basically one stroke, and this would take at least 2 strokes to do. And these do have the same origin, and I'll talk about that later on. But the italic is also a little bit more what you could consider cursive, a little bit more casual than the Roman. So if you look at this A, it's going up a little bit higher as if it sort of had a flourishy finish. If you look at the G, it's going up a little bit. And there's just a little bit of a sense of calligraphy about that italic. And I guess that's true of the Roman too, but in some fonts it is much more so of the italic. It's not particularly true of this font, but another characteristic of italics is that they tend to be narrower than Romans, and that's how the first italics came in. Is they were come in to make pocketbooks because they were more efficient and you could get more words on a page. It made printing books cheaper and faster. It's only years later that someone thought to bring italics and Romans together. They often were not in families, so someone would have to pick an italic that sort of paired nicely with a Roman before typefaces were designed in bigger families. Now, another difference in fonts is weight. And I have all one family here. It's a font I bought for a freelance project a couple of years ago. It's one of my favorite serif fonts. It's called Publico. And this is going from a lighter weight. This would be a book weight. This is a letter designed to be used at reading size, so probably 9-point or 10-point. It's designed to be in columns of text, like a newspaper or a magazine or a manual that you would read quite a bit. Read for a length, and it's designed to get in it, but there are versions that are bolder and they can be used for emphasis. Now, in practice, I rarely use bold serifs. I think they tend to look a little bit clunky as they get bold, and they tend not to stand out as much as a sans serif would. So when I do that sort of thing, I usually pick a bolder version of a sans serif, because if you look at these, you can see it's a relatively subtle difference between them. It's a much bigger difference between the ones on the end, but it's relatively subtle. They start to get like a little bit distorted. And sans serifs, let me just go do this slide first, just tend to have a lot more options and a lot more range for getting them bolder. So we can go from really thin with the sans and really heavy with the sans, and none of these characters look, at least to my eye, and you have to make your own decisions about this as a typographer, but at least to my eye, none of these fonts look awkward. Whereas with these guys, there's a little bit of awkwardness as the weights get a bit bolder. Now, this is a little bit more obscure, but this is also both versions of Politico, and this is another way fonts can vary. Fonts can vary by the size they're intended to be used at. And so one of these sets of A's was intended to be used at large sizes, and one of them was, or display sizes we could say, and one of them was intended to be used at text sizes. And when I do this lecture live in the classroom, usually a student or two guesses that this is a version intended for display. And that is exactly opposite. The reason this font is bolder is because if it's going to be printed, it needs to stand up. If it's going to be printed at small sizes, it needs to stand up on the page. If this stroke got too thin, there's a good chance that it might fade out, and I'll have a font in a bit where that's a particular problem. Whereas this font, it's much more delicate in the thinner strokes, as you can see. It's much more delicate in the serifs. And so if it's being used above 36 or 50 points, then these bars are still going to be pretty big enough to hold out. The ink is not going to drop away. One of the things that can happen on paper is what's called dot gain and dot loss. A ink can print a little bit darker, a little bit lighter than it is intended. And so the sturdiness of these fonts is intended to make sure there isn't that kind of loss. And this would expand into other parts of the design. For example, the punctuation marks, the periods would be disproportionately large. Here they'd probably be a little bit smaller. And of course to the other letters. A lot of times if you don't have a display font for display, if you're forced to use a regular serif, Well, some of them look better at that than others, but a lot of times I'll take the punctuation marks or periods or commas and I'll shrink them down just because they don't look so distractingly big. So we looked at that slide. Now another variation in type is width, and all of my sans serifs, and this is again the sans serif with no little tags, come from a family called Verb, which I like. It has a nice modern feel, but it's not so over designed as to be a distraction. It's a little bit similar, but a little bit more of a relaxed font than Antenna, which is another kind of font in this family. And I don't want to overload you with one lecture, so we'll talk about serif categorizations at a later lecture. But as you can see, these vary by width and weight. So by the time you have all these different widths and weights and Romans and italics, you have what can be a really large family. And this is, in fact, a family of about 50 or 60 fonts to accommodate all those widths, all those weight changes, and all those different stresses. But it gives you, if you have those, some people call them super families, it gives you a lot of flexibility when you sit down to design, because you have a lot of tools in your chest to pull from. Now, when would you pick this one rather than this one? Well, I would say, by and large, the condensed do better at bigger sizes. Generally, if you have a long headline and you're trying to jam it in a space that's too small, that's when you might use a condensed font. At text sizes, condensed fonts can look a little bit off-putting. Often you probably want to use a full length or no skinnier than this at text sizes, but these can be really useful for if you want a big, bold, impactful headline. Fonts are broken into subcategories within their families, and I want to talk just a little bit about some of the most common ones. And I should also say that it's nice to know, and it's nice to know for a couple of reasons. One, because some fonts have, because of their historical design, have better functions or different functions than other fonts, and some fonts are better at other things, but all of these fonts, and I talked about family resemblance, all of these fonts are modern versions, essentially, of original type. So if you take a typeface that was designed in 1400, and believe me, people do, and you redraw it, there's a lot of ways that font can change. One, you're looking at it through a modern aesthetic. Two, you're creating it for modern equipment. And three, you may have a different source for it. So, and I do a lecture about this specifically later on, I believe, but if, say, and we talked in the last recent lecture about the technology, about punches used to make type, and of course type was printed in their leftover books and fonts, and there was, and fonts are designed at different sizes, and back in the metal days, you had to actually cut a letter to the size you wanted. You couldn't just hit Command-Shift left caret on your keyboard and make it bigger. If you wanted to have a 10-point font and a 12-point font, you had to cut them both. And again, size comes into it, so those were probably cut slightly differently because each letter had to individually be cut by metal. So if you're designing a modern version of a font, and let me just bring up Garamond, which we'll look at in a minute. Garamond is, actually we looked at it, that's the one we just sort of compared to the Sans. Garamond is one of your older type forms, but if someone was to make a different version of it, did they base it on the punch that the person used? Did they base it on a book that was set in that typeface? Did they have all the characters, or did they have to invent some of them? Did they base it on the 12-point or the 10-point size? Did they base it on, if they did base it on a printed book, was the type new and relatively sharp when that book was printed, or had it been around and used for a few jobs, so it was a little bit duller. So there's a lot of, even if you're doing a like really long-standing, long-lived font like Garamond, there's a lot of ways to change how it is interpreted and how it is executed. And that is why, even if you go to Adobe Types, and I invite you to do this, and you can play with a font like Garamond yourself, or mess around with it. I don't like using the word play, but you could work around with it a bit yourself, and you can see. But even on Adobe, there's multiple versions of Garamond, and they're all a little bit different. They have family resemblances, but they're all not quite exactly the same. So here are the three main categories of most common categories for type that you would use with text for serif. And the first of these is what's called a old-fashioned, and this is in fact a version of Garamond. This is what's called a transitional, and I would say the majority of types in use today for text are transitionals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And this is what's called a modern, and you could see some superficial differences between them. This one is certainly much higher contrast than the other two, and this one is probably categorized as somewhere as in between, but let's look at that a little bit closer. So this version of Garamond, an old style font, they come in the mid 1400s as typefaces, and they are just dominant for the next 300 years until we get transitionals in the mid 1700s, and then the late 1700s, hardly any time at all, and we have moderns. And again, all of these may not be pure expressions of what that means, but they do have family resemblances, and a couple of them are this. The old style tends to look a little bit more hand-drawn. So if you look at the stroke, the A, it's almost like we're running out of ink a little bit there. It's almost like we could see a sense of the vestigial pen stroke at the top of that A, where there's a little bit of a bump there. And we could see that the serifs are not exactly equal, as if they were hand cut. And that's not true of all old styles, but it's some of the things that are common to them. And then another thing typographers talk about is stress. And if you think about stress as kind of a connect the dots game, you tend to, and you're connecting the thinnest part of the letter in the bowl of just G. If you're connecting the thinnest part of it, then to the thinnest part, it has a fairly intense stress. So let's go all the way from the old style to the modern. And let's look at this. Now we see that this is a letter that could not possibly be drawn with at least a broad pen. It is a tool of mostly compasses and straight edges, and it has another characteristic that is common to moderns, and they're also called didones, but you don't need to know both terms until you really decide you want to dig deep into this stuff. The other thing about it is, with both of these other ones, you'll note that we curve into the serif. It's like that there's still a sense of that pen as it moves down, creating that curve. And typographers have a term for that curve, which is called a bracket. And when they're thinking about typefaces, one of the things they think about is, are they bracketed serifs? And obviously this one, our transitional, is also bracketed, but it is a much more regular bracket. We're losing that sense of homemade. They're a little bit more symmetrical. In this case, not so much, but in the case of the lowercase I, those are almost exactly symmetrical brackets. And they also tend to be about midway in contrast between the modern. The modern is very extreme, and the old style is a little bit looser. Not perfectly true of every font, but true of these. And they also have, let me throw in a new typographical term, they tend to have a larger X height. So if you look at the size of what goes, the height of the lowercase letter, I mean, not the dot on the I, but the height of the lowercase letter, this one is just a little bit bigger. It goes above that blue line. Now, I will we'll talk more about this later on, but all of these letters are sitting on what a typographer would call a baseline. This line here is the cap height. That's the height the caps go. And by the way, when we talk about baselines and cap heights, letters are designed to look like they're sitting on them, but that doesn't mean that they always exactly are. A lot of times the letter will go a little bit above the X height, like this A does, just because visually it's a skinny letter, and this would make it look like it lined up. Say we had a capital H next to it, it would look more like it's lining up with that H just because it's in fact a little bit higher. But this line here is the X height, and that's the height of a lowercase x, would sit at about that height, and that's sort of the basic grid if you were to sit down and design a typeface. Now, this is just another example of an old style. These forms go all the way back to Rome. This is the column of Trajan, and it is considered one of the finest examples of the earliest typography. And you'll see it is a serif. It's speculated. I don't think anyone knows for sure. I don't know how many extant records there are of stone carvers and sign painters, but it's speculated that the serifs came because these were painted with a broad brush, and the stone cover just came in. It was considered, it was noticed to be aesthetic, and the stone cutter came in and mimicked that round curve that the painter had left for them. Apparently, there is still occasionally on these old stone things some residue of paint, so they do know that that was the process, how they were made. And this is, by the way, a modern typeface based on that called Trajan, after the column. There's a couple weights of it, and this is just capitals because that's all there were back then. Over time, the lowercase evolved from the capitals, and over time the italics evolved mostly from the lowercase, and we'll look at that in a later lecture. So a couple of other fonts that are different styles, and I'll just tell you what these are quickly, but if you think about the serifs we saw, we have these spiky serifs here, and that can't possibly be one of those three. And we also have these perfectly square serifs here, sort of like the modern font did, but much bigger and bolder. The weight, or almost the weight, but I think the weight in this case, of the body of the letter itself. And then we have this one, which could almost be a transitional. The difference is that it has just a little bit more foot under it. It's kind of a jacked up transitional. So it's kind of between these two. And this is, just for your information, known as a Clarendon. This is known as a glyphic font, anything that has spiky serifs. And this is the one you will probably engage with most often. Clarendons I just not use that much anymore. And glyphics, you see them occasionally, but they're a very specialized font. They're a font with a lot of personality, so people use them a little bit gingerly. But this slab serif, or sometimes called an Egyptian because that's the name of the first slab serif, get used quite a bit. If you have a big clunky serif, those get used, I mean, not for text usually, occasionally, but often for display type. Now, another concept, and this is just sort of an old maid here thrown out, is the other thing about the difference between these fonts is how they sit on the page. We've been looking at these as individual characters and talking about how, the difference that characters have, but they also look a little bit different when you get them on the page. So, I mean, this one, that's the modern. You could see it almost start to drop out, like I said, type could, just because it's so delicate and we're looking at it relatively small. So it's almost fading away at those skinny areas. So if you were to pick a font like this for printing, you would want to make sure it was a good printer and they were going to do as well as they do a good job with that print. Whereas a couple of these other things are just standing up at small sizes a little bit better, even on screen. And this is a slab serif. That's a slab serif optimized for for text sizes, and this is, I believe, our transitional, and that is our old style. And they just have slightly different presence, slightly different feels on the page. And to a typographer, and I often make text a part of this class, but you will certainly be a part of your class when you get to 313. But to a typographer, this is described as color. It doesn't mean that the font is red or blue or green. It means how even and how consistent it is on the page. And so this one, I mean, they all have sort of reasonable colors to themselves, but if we were to take a, let's say, a black and white picture of this page, and we were to take that picture into Photoshop and we were to blur it out, we would get slightly different, probably even, but slightly different grayish tones representing these. This one, because it's such a high contrast font, and also because there's fairly big spaces between the words in this case, might look a little splotchy. And so an even tone in type, typographers like to describe as good color, something that's a little bit splotchy, or that's too dark, or that's too light. And that darkness or lightness can happen because there wasn't enough ink, or there was too much ink, or it could happen because when the plate was exposed, it was underexposed, or it wasn't developed as much. There's a lot of ways to screw up color, but that's one of the things someone working with text types is after, is a nice even color. And so here is a little bit more of an even color. This is all the same font, and so it looks a little bit more smooth and even on the page compared to that.